everyone who I haven't said hello to already. I'm Suzanne St. Pierre, partner in the real estate department at Venable, and I would like to welcome you to our Law and Education Forum, which is a series of presentations about legal and business issues facing educational institutions today. And today we are going to talk about unlocking the hidden potential of your real estate. A few housekeeping notes. This is being recorded for educational purposes, and a recording of this program will be put on our website. CLE credit is available, and you can sign up on the little cafe table outside the door if you haven't already. And you have a package of materials which contains this PowerPoint and also some other materials that we think you will find useful relating to the subject matter of the presentation. I'd like you to introduce you to the other speakers today. Francis Hall-Sand is a partner at Clement Hall-Sand Architects. Susan Wallace is a principal at Vivacian Owner Representation. And both Francis, in her capacity as an architect, and Susan, in her capacity as an owner's representative, work extensively with educational institutions in important capital projects. And our other speaker today will be my partner, Sue Golden. Sue works in areas of real estate, construction, land use, and zoning. And both Sue and I work extensively with educational institutions and other not-for-profit clients. I think we have a few other Venable attorneys who I'd like to introduce in attendance. Dan Bernstein, Ben Argyle, Sharon Connolly. I thought I saw Ashley Dunn. Maybe she'll be back. Maybe I'll just start to get a sense from the audience, how many people have participated in a significant amount of capital projects at their institution? Yes, I know you have. And who do we have on the phone, may I ask?
They're actually muted.
Oh, they're muted. Oh, okay. Sorry. We'll just filter. Okay. So we have some experience with capital projects here. It looks like here we are. Here's our roadmap today. We're going to start by the title of our seminar is Ways of Unlocking the Hidden Potential of Your Real Estate. So we're going to talk about two ways that educational institutions can do that. The use of transferable development rights and co-development of real property, and then we're going to step back and talk about how those projects can be implemented by the institution, and that's going to be a discussion of master planning and organizational readiness. And we invite you to jump in, give us comments and questions as we go along. It's a small enough group that it should be hopefully an interactive session. And with that, we'll start with transferable development rights, and I will hand the clicker to you.
So just to start out with some basics, and this TDR discussion is focused on New York City zoning, although some of the concepts transfer to other jurisdictions, but this is about New York. Zoning regulates use and building size, or as we call it, bulk. So it's kind of size, shape, and each plot of land in the city has a designation from which a zoning attorney can tell you about those different regulations. So I've listed some of the uses. For bulk, which is sort of the direction we're going with the TDR, it's height and setback, which you can see in the little diagram. Setback is how the building steps back out a certain height and then goes up further. Coverage, the amount of the lot that the building is permitted to fill. So there's a little yard in the back there, open space in yards, and then floor area ratio. And the floor area ratio is the built square footage that counts for zoning. So cellars don't count, and certain mechanical spaces don't count, but otherwise most of your floor area counts for zoning purposes. And the zoning resolution sets a certain what we call floor area ratio, that is the maximum that can be built on a lot. So it's calculated by total floor area divided by the lot area. And there's a nice little diagram here that shows how that plays out. This one shows an FAR, or floor area ratio, of 1 on a 10,000 square foot, with a 10,000 square foot building covering 100% of the lot. Or you can arrange that same FAR in 2 stories on half of the lot and have open space, or in another diagram on 25% of the lot and have 4 stories. So there are different ways to arrange your floor area that can be somewhat within your control and somewhat subject to other types of zoning regulations like the height and setback, the yard, and open space requirements. Your development rights that might be available for transfer is the difference between what's allowed and what's already built on the site. So if you've got a building that is, we call it underbuilt for the zoning, then you may have development rights available for transfer. And what I wanted to focus on today is an as-of-right transfer of development rights by merger of zoning lots. So this is, a zoning lot is the lot that Department of Buildings looks at for zoning purposes. It's not necessarily synonymous with the tax lot. You can combine tax lots into a single zoning lot if they are contiguous for a minimum of 10 linear feet and located within a single block. So for this purpose of an as-of-right zoning lot merger, you don't go across streets. And they're not required to be in the same ownership, which is how we get to the idea of transferring development rights. When 2 or more lots are declared to be a single zoning lot, we do this by way of a recorded declaration. It's got a little drawing in it. It's signed by all of the owners, and any party in interest has to either sign on or waive their right to sign. So you would engage a title company to identify parties that have an interest in the real property. The most typical is a lender. Next would be, an easement holder or a lessee with a recorded interest that could be affected by the transfer of the development rights. So you always have to think not just about what can we as owners do, but how will our lender be affected? Do we need to get a consent? Or is this going to affect the lender's underwriting so that they won't agree to let us do this transfer? The other big thing to think about is that once you give these rights away, it's permanent. It runs with the land, and your lot will always be connected with the other lot. So that for all development you want to do on your lot, changes that you want to do on your lot, you'll be affected by what's built on the other lot and the fact that you no longer have these development rights to use on your lot. And then if you ever hear about Department of Building exhibits, these Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, and 4, these are documents that Department of Buildings requires to be filed with permits to document what is the zoning lot on which a certain project is going to be built. So if you hear these terms, you'll just know, oh, that has to do with my zoning lot, and you can contact the title company and the zoning attorney to make sure that you get the right forms done. So the way the transfer itself works is that once you have merged your zoning lot, your tax lot, with another owner's tax lot, you can then use the available development rights on any portion of the lot that's permitted by zoning. Department of Buildings will now look at that lot as a single lot, and so they will, if you're required to have a certain amount of open space on the lot or a certain kind of height and setback on the lot, they will look at it as a totality. And you can shift, shown in this diagram, you can shift development from one to the other. That's the transfer. So that the owner of the gray lot can acquire those development rights and pay for them, and then you have this permanent, now you've got two buildings, and they're together for zoning purposes. And one of them is benefiting by the increased height. One thing also to think about when you are considering if you've got development rights to transfer, it may not be your nearest neighbor that can use them. It may be that there's another lot on the block that can use them, and there are ways for developers to sort of put together multiple lot zoning lots so that they pick up a lot of pieces along a block and transfer the air rights even several lots down, so that the intervening lots are not benefiting from any of the transfer, but they're involved in the zoning lot, and there's a cost to that for a developer because they've got to pay that owner to allow for the transfer. But that gets you, because of the requirement that there has to be 10 contiguous feet between each of the lots on a zoning lot, you can sort of skip over some by involving them in the merger. So that's how you see some of these really tall buildings being built, because they are acquiring development rights from multiple lots on a single block and putting them all together in a package and building on just one spot a really tall tower, and everybody else is giving up their development rights for that. So how do you find out if you have any of these development rights? Initially, based on either information that you may have in-house from prior projects or other kinds of information that you can provide, and some publicly available information, attorneys can do a really rough calculation for you of, we can look at the zoning, we can tell you your building is approximately this many square feet, so you probably do have or you don't have. And then before you would go further with a deal, you would want to confirm with an architect or a surveyor to have an exact count done so that you can confirm for sure what you've got. Think about what you want to keep and what you're willing to transfer. It's more complicated than just looking at the lot area and what's built, because you also have to think about other kinds of restrictions that could limit how the development rights can be used. So, for example, if you're a landmark building or in a historic district, you'd want to know if there are any title restrictions or easements on record that limit the use of development rights or other kinds of building on the site or the acquiring site. If there are prior zoning approvals, variances, for example, that would limit your ability to transfer. And then, of course, there's zoning and multiple dwelling law requirements that can restrict how the development rights can be arranged on the lot. Things like the distance between buildings, if there are residential uses, that sort of thing can affect how they can be used. So you're going to want somebody to take a look at all of this history as part of the due diligence in doing a deal. And then once you have a deal, the form of the agreement, there's a purchase and sale agreement that looks somewhat like a purchase and sale agreement for real property, but deals with some of these additional issues with zoning. And then the permanent document that goes on record in addition to the declaration is called a zoning lot development agreement. And that everybody calls a ZELDA. It's agreement among the owners of the properties that are in the zoning lot. So if you've got only one owner in the single zoning lot, obviously you don't need this kind of agreement, but once you enter into a merged zoning lot with other owners, you're going to want to have this agreement because it governs the rights of each party to use the zoning rights, how the site is going to be developed over time. Remember, these are now, in perpetuity, real property tied together, so you're going to want to be able to deal with violations from Department of Buildings on one lot will affect the ability to get building permits on another. Rights in casualty, how you can rebuild, it's all going to be tied together, even though they are separate buildings. Changes in zoning, how you're going to cooperate in filing applications for permits, and then indemnities and other kinds of legal rights among the parties. So you want to have that in place. And then typically a ZELDA will include an easement for light and air for the building that's being increased in height over the building that is giving up the development rights. And for that easement, you need a subordination from your parties in interest. So that's another spot where your lender is going to have to consent. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on is outside of the as of right, there are all kinds of special permit transfers in large-scale plans, special districts, inclusionary housing, and designated landmarks, where you can have special rights to transfer within a district, or this is an example of transferring across an intersection of landmark development rights. So it's one of the benefits of owning landmark property. You can't build it yourself up higher, but you can take those rights and transfer them to a broader area than you would be able to do as a right with a zoning law merger. So those are things to consider and decide if they fit your property. So very brief overview, just to sort of get us started into one of our examples. I think Pierre will take it over here.
Sure. So this is a rarefied example of the age of this whole situation. The Cathedral St. John the Divine is roughly 16 acres in upper Manhattan, and they own the entire thing, and they were running out of money a few years ago, so they were trying to look at ways that they could use their 1 million square feet of CDRs to do something with it. Since they owned the entire site, they didn't have to transfer rights, and also since they own their own site, I should say, they didn't want to sell any portion of the site. So what they were looking at was a long-term lease with developers who could build something on that site. What they did was really remarkable. The first thing they did was they stopped and said, well, let's try and imagine our own future for the next couple of hundred years. Let's be very sure that whatever we do in the future doesn't restrict our own ability to carry out our own mission. And I can't say enough about how important that is, because I think when you suddenly realize, 1 million square feet times whatever that number is, you start losing track of your mission and start going towards the bank. So they said, no, okay, we understand our mission and how much space we need. And then the next thing they did, which was even more clever, I think, is they got together with the Landmarks Commission. This is not a landmark site. And they agreed that in the event that the cathedral was landmarked, that the area around the cathedral would not be landmarked, and that they established with the commission building envelopes where it would be possible to create a building that landmarks and everybody else would agree to. So they drew this 200-foot high box, which is not higher than the cathedral. That was the idea, keep it within the limits of the cathedral is always the tallest building on the site. And they got everyone's approval that within that building envelope, a developer could build something and there would be no further restrictions. Again, very important, because then it meant that they could go out to developers and say, you can fill up this box, and that will be allowed. Our developer then they put out an RFP. The developers came back, and our developer figured out that in fact you get 300 apartments, 150 parking spaces, and live happily ever after on the site. So it was a deal that was able to go through because in advance the lawyers, the real estate people, everyone had agreed that you could build on that site in this way. They still have another 700,000 or 800,000 square feet of development rights, so stay tuned. Okay, we're going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about co-development of real property. And I'll define what I mean by that, because I think I may have made up that term. I'm going to define co-development as a transaction where an educational institution contributes property that it owns to a multi-user project, which would include the educational institution, or to a third-party project in furtherance of its mission. And some examples of that would be an educational institution has a property with unused development rights and wants to build an addition on their building and have the building allocated for shared use by two facilities, or maybe there's a property that an educational institution would like to redevelop for use by itself and another user, or maybe there's some underutilized property that the educational institution wants to make available for a third-party use. Maybe the educational institution wants to develop that property for the third-party user. Maybe there are programmatic alliances between the two organizations, and there are ways that the institution may use that property without actually being the owner or the tenant. And in these transactions, the third party could be another for-profit, or it could be another nonprofit, or it could be a for-profit user. And really, in thinking about these transactions and in the slides that follow, you're going to hear me coming back to the threshold considerations in these transactions, which are risk, control, cost, and time. And you can probably say that those are big considerations in any development project. You can structure these transactions in many different ways, and maybe the simplest way is the educational institution has property and they're going to be the developer, and those transactions are typically structured either as a purchase and sale agreement with the conveyance of a condo unit, or possibly a vertical subdivision, or perhaps a build-to-suit lease. And this puts all the control in the hands of the institution, but of course, you need to have the money to do the project, you need to have the time and the expertise to do the project, and that's not always feasible. So perhaps the third party will act as the developer. And when you have a third party transaction that is going to, a third party developer in a structure that involves a conveyance, here's where the risk starts increasing and the control starts decreasing. Because the developer wants an ownership interest in the property before they start building on it. And if they have a lender, the lender is likely going to require them to have an interest and is going to want to mortgage that interest. The institution might be on board with that, but says, if this doesn't work out, we need our property back, or we need to be made whole in some other way. So we try to structure transactions to address those competing needs, and they can include a construction period lease or license to the third-party developer, which will be replaced with the conveyance of a fee interest, say a condominium unit, when the project is complete. Another possible structure is to convey the entire property to the developer at the outset, and in that case, the institution wants to be really sure that there's a lot of security, a lot of carrots and sticks, in a legal sense, to make sure that the legal obligation of the developer to reconvey typically a condominium unit back to the school is met. Sometimes these transactions are structured with a vertical subdivision at the outset, where three-dimensional areas of space, which are each separate tax lots, are created, which roughly would correspond to the areas to be occupied by the third party and the educational institution. And then at the completion of the project, a condominium is formed. These kind of structures, I kind of think of them as mutually assured destruction, because I don't think that you can, there are a few examples in New York City, but there are a lot of ancillary agreements when you have them where people actually own separate volumes of space and manage to operate them jointly. The conventional way to do that is a condominium. So you create the structure, and okay, the developer has the mortgageable interest that they need to do the building, but neither party can really go forward in any efficient way. So it draws everybody back to the table in a sense. If the third party is developing and there's a lease structure, then the lease is going to say if the development is not completed in accordance with the plans by a date certain, then the institution has the right to terminate the lease and get the property back. And of course, there are going to be a million reasons why that date is going to have to be extended, and it's not as easy as it looks, but it's simpler than a conveyance structure. In any third-party development scenario that involves a lender, and even in some cases where there's other sorts of funding, we always have to think of the rights of the developer's lender up front. And a lot of educational institutions are doing their own projects with money that they raise that maybe doesn't have a lot of strings attached to it, or government funding where the requirements are lighter than they would be in, say, a bank finance transaction. So in a sense, you could say, well, this is not my problem, but it really is the educational institution's problem, because this is going to come up in the negotiation, and if the other party's bank is not satisfied that they have what they need, sooner or later the transaction is going to fall apart or be renegotiated. And those rights include notices, extended cure periods, limitations on the lender's obligations. They're not going to want to be obligated to the same extent as the borrower, but of course the institution wants the project to be built. They'll want an extended period of control if a default occurs, even more so if the developer owns the property, because then the lender is going to have to get the property back. And in cases where the third party's use of the property is very narrowly defined, the lender will often want broader rights if they come in and take over, because they're looking ahead to a possible default scenario and thinking, if I need to find someone else to come in and finish this project and take over this space, I want a property that is attractive to the maximum number of purchasers possible. Also, in some cases, there can be simultaneous development by both parties. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide because it gives me an immediate headache. There are a lot of risks of construction coordination and other risks. Sometimes this could happen at the end of the job. Maybe most of the job is being built by one party, the other party comes in and does a sit out towards the end of the job. So it can be done. It's something that takes a lot of thought, but generally that's not the way we want to structure it. So you've found your partner, and you've been talking about how great it would be to do a project together, and you start thinking about terms, and now it's time to think about when are we going to sign an agreement. You could wait until the design is advanced or even completed. You could jointly work on a design that works for both of you. Here again, coming back to the risk, you're mitigating the risk because you actually know what you're building, and it's in very well-defined plans and specifications. You have an idea of what the cost will be, how long it will take to build before you sign on the dotted line. On the flip side, there's a cost to that. Who's going to pay for the architect to design these great plans, the pre-construction services that a Zubatkin might provide or a construction manager may provide? In cases like this, typically some letter agreement or letter of intent would be signed at the outset of the project to discuss any cost sharing, breakup fees, cost reimbursement if the deal doesn't happen. Or maybe you start at the beginning when you're in schematic, or you just have a nice idea on the back of a napkin. There, the risks are going to be greater because you don't really know if the project is feasible or what the cost is. And in cases like that, we spend time at the outset giving the educational institution the rights they need to redesign if their budget is exceeded, and the right to terminate. And that can be a toughie once the contract is signed to get out. And when we do that, we think about points where the transaction actually can terminate. Going back to the third party that has a lender, we can't have that other party borrowing the money, entering into the loan, closing the loan, and then the educational institution says, this isn't really working out, right? This is going to be really hard to unwind at this point. So we look at all of the steps in the critical path and we figure out maybe there's more than one point where there's the possibility to terminate, and then there's a point of no return where the parties have to say, okay, maybe there are other remedies after this point, but getting out of the deal is not one of them. I just want to go through some of the major issues that we see in the co-development agreements, which can take various forms. One is the design approval process. If you're starting before the design is completed, it's really important to have milestones which are going to come straight out of the architect's agreement, and there are going to be timeframes agreed for review and comments on plans so that the design can be completed in a timely way. It's also really important to limit the party's right to require elective change orders, by which I mean not a change order because the law has changed or because there's a hidden condition, but in addition to scope or someone's changed their mind. You know, there's nothing like someone who keeps changing their mind to increase the cost and time of a project, and everybody's smiling because they probably been in that situation.
And I'm thinking there's something missing from that list that we've been challenged with a number of times, which is that I think on that list should be establishment of an initial budget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes that process is left open-ended, and there's been an indication at the beginning of a budget that ends up being 3 times what it is, and it's accepted by the client that the road is very rough getting there.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's not as easy as...
It's rough on the architect.
It's a chicken and egg question, right? Because the organization may aspire to raise funds so that they can build a project of X, so there's that problem, but then there are also often political considerations about actually committing to a number.
Right. Well, I mean, it's buried in the design approval process, but if it's not there, it's hard to know what you're designing to.
Right, and then...
It's a very, very discipline-focused perspective that the budget is key.
And it has to happen at milestones with those designs. So you're checking in and reconfirming that that's fine.
Yeah.
At those things.
Right, because we're going to write our architect's agreement and we're going to say, you need to design to budget, and if we go over budget, we're going to ask you to redesign without additional compensation, and you're going to say, well, what's the budget? That is an excellent point. Both parties need to approve the construction contract, and I think that there's an art form here in not putting the other party, the party who's not signing the construction contract, at the table, but yet involving that party early enough in the process. And Susan is looking at me knowingly because we're in this exact scenario right now where somebody got the contract perhaps a little too late, and you think you're nearly finished, and then your co-development partner has 30 comments to the contract, so that needs to be managed carefully. How to track and attribute project costs is also something that requires a lot of thought, and at the end of the day, the parties may agree to something as simple as, you pay 40%, I'll pay 60%, but that's not an arbitrary decision. There are a lot of things that can be done. There can be different GMPs within a construction contract. If one party's scope of work is relatively small compared to the other, there could be a change order that contains a separate scope of work. There are a lot of different things you can do, but that's something that requires a lot of thought. We recommend to our clients, as we do in all development projects, to have an interim arbitrator, to actually pick a human being, put his or her name in the contract on the day one when everybody's friendly and happy and thinks the other one has the greatest judgment in the world, Because if a dispute arises, time is your enemy on a construction project. If a dispute arises during design or construction, you want to be able to call upon someone who can make the decision, if you can't make it yourself, binding through substantial completion. After the job is done, if someone wants to go to court, they can do that, but in the interim, the project can move on with a minimum of delay. Consequences of delay, I alluded to previously. As an educational institution, often the projects are timed to coincide with the start of a new academic year. So what happens when the schedule is in jeopardy? Is the party at fault going to pay the rent for the educational institution to secure substitute space, if that's even possible? Is liquidated damages a helpful remedy? Is there a right to walk away at some point? So these are things that have to be thought through. And then it's also important to talk about what the parties are going to do if a construction defect is identified down the line. There's going to be one party typically who's going to sign the construction agreement with the CM. If there's a problem after the fact, that party is going to have to enforce the contract for the other party's benefit. But there are questions. Do I have to litigate this? Who's going to pay for it? This should all be decided up front. And then a few final thoughts. It's kind of tough. Some projects fall apart because the parties can't, the co-developers can't make up their mind in time. I think it's important to have milestones and a drop dead date, even at the outset of the project, to avoid a lot of delays. Some projects are not going to happen, but you need to know that before you get way down the line, because the coordination between the two parties does take time. It's also important to identify project-specific requirements that may only seemingly be applicable to one party. One example is a lot of city-funded construction will require LEED Silver certification. So what happens if one user is funding their fit-out with city funds and the other party is not? Does the whole building have to be LEED Silver? Is it possible that one part of the building is LEED Silver and the other isn't? Just need to identify things like that up front so that the proper requirements can be reflected in both the design and the construction.
Another example of that is labor and the requirements around the specific type of labor that might be driven by a funding source. You want to know that really early because that has a significant impact on your budget question as well.
Major, yeah. It's also important to think about whether the project as constructed is going to benefit from a real property tax exemption. And you need to try to structure the transaction at the outset to preserve that. And as we discussed previously, who's the lender here? What are their concerns? Let's get it right the first time so that we don't have to go back.
If I could just chime in for a minute, because at my previous firm, I worked on the Avalon project, and the developer was assuming certain property tax exemption, 421A. In order to get the best property tax exemption that they could, we had to create a sliver lot along 110th Street that was not applying for benefits, so that the building sits upon a ground leased lot north of it and could get a longer, better property tax exemption for its project, which helps the underwriting, which helps them pay the ground rent to the institution. There had to be flexibility on the church's part to create this separate tax lot to allow the developer to do what they wanted to do within the terms that they anticipate. So there are a number of factors, unintended, and one party's concern becomes another.
Yeah, economic incentive for a for-profit party. So I'll leave you with the rest of the slides to peruse at your leisure, and we'll move on to master planning. And I'm going to turn the clicker over to Frances and ask her to start off the construction by the discussion, by telling us what master planning means for institutions, educational institutions, large and small.
Right, so this really goes back to mission. Where do these projects come from? We've been sounding this morning as though they all come from, wait a minute, there's a lot of money to be made if I can sell something on my lot. But in fact, I think especially for a not-for-profit institution, their mission is actually not making money for themselves, oddly enough. So there are three examples here of how master plans come about, and each one is very different. But this is all about understanding your mission clearly enough so that when these opportunities arise, or if these opportunities arise, you know how to take advantage of them. I would also add to that we've been hearing a phenomenal amount about the kind of magic that goes on behind the scenes with your lawyers. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea.
You call it magic.
I think it is in the sense that one day you say, look, we found this for you. This is going to be yours. And I think in some ways architects are doing the same thing. They're looking over the whole program of requirements and looking for those magical moments. Look, you can do this thing if you choose to. So here are three examples of different ways of master plans starting up. This one is Brown University in 2001. Ruth Simmons became the president of Brown, and she took over an institution that was very proud of its history. And in her view, it was time to move forward on that history and do something else in the future. And so she started with an academic plan, a strategic academic plan. Rule one: do not start with your architect or even with your lawyer. Start with your own vision of what your plan should be. And her plan was going to be that she was going to immediately hire 100 more faculty so that the school could begin to expand. She was also in deep trouble from day one because Brown was planning a big medical school building in the historic College Hill campus, and the neighbors, as soon as they heard about this building, already discovered a cancer cluster on that street as a result of the building, and there hadn't even been a drawing yet. So she knew that she was going to have trouble with the neighbors, and part of the idea of adding 100 faculty was the idea that the school really needed to become more of a research university and compete with the other Ivies at that level. So she said she needed a master plan to find out, had they run out of space on College Hill? Was it over, or was there still room to build? So we did a quick study of what in 1764, Brown University was that little red dot on the map. And then just looking very quickly at what happened every 50 years, how did these places expand? By roughly 1800, there were a few new buildings, and the one over on the right was the gym. They had a gym by then, just so you could keep track. 50 years later, if you look at the top, Pembroke College started off, and it was a separate little, all in one little building, started off at the top of the map. And then let's go another 50 years. Brown has now taken over that whole block. Pembroke is starting to take over its whole block. By 1950, we're starting to see much bigger buildings, everything in the upper right now. What had been the gym is now turned into an entire athletic complex, and now with a hockey rink and a swimming pool and a field house. By the time we came on the scene, 2002, this is what Brown looked like. And so the question was, can we expand? Should we expand? Well, the neighbors let us expand, but by the way, we have to expand. We did a series of studies to find out what was the capacity of what was there. So we looked at buildings by use to see where different things were located, and you can see the blue is the academic buildings of Pembroke. I should say, I'm sorry, it's the residences. By 2002, Pembroke and Brown had joined up. They'd actually joined up in the 1970s, but on paper there were still two separate campuses, so there was something missing there. We looked at a building evaluation. We said, let's step aside from architecture. Is it beautiful? Is it old? Let's talk about, is it usable? Are these usable containers that can be translated and made into something else? We looked at green spaces, which were, of course, very important. So we just kept going through these different iterations, trying to find out what the keys to the future might be. Out of all of this, we came up with 3 planning principles. So they're not descriptions of what the program needs would be for these buildings. Because Brown already had 2 million square feet of space, they didn't really know what their next building would be, but they needed to know where could we put it. So the first thing we said was really in line with their mission. We said you need to develop circulation infrastructure, by which we meant it's time to connect Pembroke and Brown together. 30 years have gone by, and you're seeing them as separate places, but they're really the same place. Consolidate the core was our way of saying, you know, your neighbors are right. You cannot keep just gobbling up land around the edges of the campus and expect everyone's going to keep loving you. And that led to item 3, move beyond College Hill. If you're really looking for big places to put big buildings, which, by the way, we've all noticed that research buildings have enormous footprints and take up enormous amounts of space. So we said part of this plan is to find another place where really big buildings can happen, and then connect all of that up with circulation infrastructure, so you can get from the top of the hill, which is on the top of the plan, down to the bottom of the hill. So we started driving around Providence with guys with mustaches, looking for places. And we looked at East Providence. We finally discovered with them the Jewelry District as a place that could be expanded. So the first project that came out of that was a green space that connected the Pembroke campus, which is at the top, with the Brown campus at the bottom. We convinced them that they didn't need to be the only Ivy League school with a gas station on their campus. Something else could happen on that site. Then we looked at their existing buildings, and we said that the blue one here represented 500,000 square feet of existing buildings that could be put to better use and be more intensely used. So in particular, all the old buildings surrounding the Brown Green had been kind of not really renovated and not really up to their potential. And then the red buildings were places where they could build new. So we found 1 million square feet of new construction possible in relatively small buildings, because now we're in this historic district. And then finally, we looked at the Jewelry District and said, this is really a place where you could buy lots of land. Little did we know that the state of Rhode Island is completely disorganized and unable to figure out how to sell the rights to where to begin. The I-95 had the I-95 highway had been moved, and therefore a whole series of old highway right-of-ways became available. This was 7 years ago. Brown is still negotiating with the state, and now the city has decided that maybe they're in charge of owning the highway rights. Meanwhile, Brown started buying up land, and the first thing they did was create a little public park in the middle of downtown to show that their true intention was to become a co-developer with the city of land down there. So again, this is a stay tuned thing. I think developers apparently move faster than state agencies may take about a millennium before they can agree on who's going to co-develop what in this area. A completely different way of looking at things, and I'm going to hope that Susan is going to interrupt here. The Sense School, Sense owns the picture, the drawing, Sense owns the big building on the top of the drawing here, and and as I understand it, one day the headmistress was sitting in her office and she looked out of her window and noticed that a real estate agent was showing the brownstone across the way. So Bodie was in that office, and she looked out and she saw a real estate agent showing that building. She got on the phone with 3 families in the school, and they bought the building. Do you want to add to that story?
Well, you'll go into it, but they thought they were just renovating a townhouse. Now you can pick up again.
we said, no, maybe this is some kind of an opportunity to create a master plan, to think of that little bit of additional space will do something amazing for you. This was an exercise in programming because the mission here really was to find out, well, our mission was to find out what their mission was. And they were really interested in creating an identity for the upper school, which has been kind of blended in and mixed in with the other middle school spaces that they shared. They had some big elements that they wished they could have that they had never had before. So in this case, the master plan, we went through actually many more iterations than this, but we sat with them and just looked at what are the different opportunities for this townhouse. We could make it into an office building and move all the administrative offices into that building, but that might not fly from a fundraising point of view. Nobody would give them a lot of money to create an office building. That wasn't going to happen. And so through a whole series of iterations, we finally established that the townhouse could be the home of the upper school. It could provide that identity for that place.
I'll just interject and say, this is an example of accidental master plan, where you don't have one, and suddenly an opportunity comes. And fortunately, they were very receptive to the ideas that the design team started, the questions that were being asked, and suddenly this townhouse became leveraged in a very different way that you're about to see. So, it's difficult sometimes for the small institutions to have that level of master plan is just kind of ready to go. But this was an opportunity, and they were receptive, and then it became a much more valuable investment.
Yeah, I can't really remember the numbers. The townhouse was about 20,000 feet, and they had about 100,000 feet. So that really gave them just
really flipped it.
Yeah. So in fact, this is a section through the whole thing with really is the upper school, and in the course of doing this, we discovered that the middle school could also have its own identity by being put on the top of the existing building, and then everybody shared in everything below. I won't go into that because happily someone else had to figure that out. But this is, of course, in a landmark district, and the townhouse was an individual landmark, which added to the complication of all the people we had to talk to even make it happen. This tiny little space, it's 16 by 16, is a little glass cube, which is the actual place where we connect the townhouse, if you see in the end, to the entire school behind us. So this is really the key to the whole project, tying everything together. This is one of the old rooms in the old townhouse, and now it's from the seminar room looking back out at that little glass cube. We were able to, they had a gym that was too small and a theater that was too small, and we said, wait, let's put the gym where the theater was and the theater where the gym was. And so again, this came out of looking at the plan. So this had been a too small gym, and now the theater is lecture space for them. And then finally, one other example of something that we're seeing more and more in every school project that we look at. Friends Seminary owns 3 townhouses, landmark district. We looked at how we could combine those 3 townhouses together with space that the school already had, so that all of it would end up being as one complete unit of school. But from the outside, it still looks like, goes away by itself. But from the outside, it looks like it's several small buildings in a landmark district.
And that's actually a really interesting example of something that a lot of our clients are starting to discuss. How can we take a project that we want to build and demonstrate it to donors, to regulating agencies, to the community where we're trying to show what we're doing and how it's going to look in the end. And technologies are now available where you can, depending on how much money you want to spend, you can actually do a film and as if you're walking through the building, or as if the building is opening up and you're seeing what's in there. So it's a really kind of interesting technologies are available. I saw one that was the traffic impacts of a particular project, and they actually had videos that you could watch, like 3 minutes of an intersection, and you would see the little cars. Unfortunately for them, they had cars crashing into each other. So watch out for that in your technologies. There are little bugs to be worked out, but it's very interesting because people can really start to visualize, which is great, obviously, in fundraising, but it's also really good for the regulatory process, because you can show your neighbors who might be concerned about a particular building a little bit more about what the experience is going to be like in a way that's perhaps more persuasive or more sort of visually accessible than a flat drawing.
It's true. Yeah, in this case, we made it look like it was really easy. And this summer, Tishman made it look like it was really easy. And put up 2 whole floors of steel over 3 months, so it can happen.
Yeah, it's a helpful communication.
Right. Yep.
Susan, do most of your clients have master plans? Should they?
I think that, well, you've got large institutions and small institutions, and there can be some clear differences there. Most institutions, although not all, at least have a strategic plan. And a strategic plan very commonly has a facility element to it. It also has other goals and objectives of the institution. And so to the extent there is at least that document, you at least, when an opportunity arises or something comes up and you need to spend some dollars, that's at least a document you can begin to reference. From that, perhaps you end up doing a larger planning exercise on facilities themselves. But we commonly see that at least there is a strategic planning process, and accredited institutions are often, asked by their accrediting agencies to see that plan. So that is very commonly in place. Larger institutions very likely have somewhat of a master plan, and then the question is when either some funding becomes available, or maybe it's even a building or a piece of equipment that needs to be replaced, it's very helpful to then go back to that plan and make sure that whatever you are spending is in line with a larger goal potentially, that you can leverage that investment in a way that actually gets you somewhere. So those are a couple of examples how planning might be in place.
And you've indicated that sometimes the unwanted maintenance repair projects can be an opportunity to
very true.
pull out the master plan.
If you're opening up a wall right here, but in fact that you really want to cable this building, at some point in a different way or a larger way, and you're already opening up the wall, well, we'll use that opportunity to, it's less expensive than opening it twice. And so look for those opportunities, as I was saying, to move in a direction, even if you're not necessarily in a capital project and in full, capital project implementation mode, but try and, at least educate the staff, particularly facility staff, so that they understand what some of the larger goals are, because they can bring you ideas. Hey, I really need to, change out this air conditioning equipment, but I know we also want to do something different on the roof. Can we combine those projects? Is there any way to do that? Would you like me to look into it? You can start leveraging your staff to the extent they're aware and educated, and also looking out for those opportunities.
So why don't we switch gears again and talk a little bit about, we have our projects, we have our master plan, we're not, but we have a capital project identified, and let's talk about organizational readiness, which is the key consideration in getting started. And maybe I'm going to throw it out to you, Susan, to start the discussion. How do organizations prepare? How should they prepare for these major projects?
Well, when we get engaged, we can often get engaged at different points in the stream of that, but if we're engaged very early, we will often assess and understand, take a little time doing a deep dive on the real goals and objectives, any opportunities or constraints, understand what the client, the organization, the institution, things they know about their project, what is their current understanding, get grounded, and then what financial resources might be available that they're aware of. So those are, some big things that we want to get an understanding about early. Secondly, we want to understand if or how they are organized to make decisions. If you ask an architect or a construction manager, what's the most important thing about being a good client, is making timely and consistent decisions. And the earlier you can make decisions, the better. It speaks to the cost, it speaks to delays, and the avoiding of changes down the road that get more and more costly as you go. And so there are a number of ways to be organized from the client side, but a governance structure where decisions are being made by the right people at the right time is very important, because what you don't want to have is 25 people around the table for 2 hours once a week. You will not get very much done. So you want people tasked at the right level to do things and know exactly where their limits of authority rest, so that you know when decisions need to go up the chain. And it's something that we will spend a lot of time on early, because again, making timely and consistent decisions is one of the best things you can do to be clear, keep your teams moving efficiently, and be cost efficient in the process. So here's an example. And again, these matrices can look very different. It's very institution specific. You might have existing committees, but very often we suggest a project-specific steering committee of some sort that has some trustee involvement. And then a project management team, more on a weekly basis, that would have key department involvement, not too many, but some key individuals working closely with an owner's rep or someone that you deem is your resource. The last thing we then look at is the internal resources that might presently exist. Again, you have different sizes of institutions. The very large institutions might have a capital projects department. But here you go, you're doing a large project. It might be the only project you ever do. It might be the most money you will ever spend as an institution. So you might consider, okay, this is bigger than what we normally do. Let me understand what other resources we might bring on to help us do this. So even large institutions with multiple buildings on a campus might, on a specific case per case, such as the co-development with a developer, that's really not your core business. You might look for those resources. Or a small school, an institute, a single building, again, it's going to be the most money you've ever spent, and it's a very anxious time for a board. And so you want to make sure that, and we try and understand what are the resources, what's the experience, what can we leverage, and then what additional resources does this particular institution need, so that we're not duplicating but integrating in the right way. So that results in a somewhat different structure in terms of how we support clients. But the one thing that everyone who has done a capital project knows from the institutional side is that you all have day jobs. This project is going to put you over, if you're a CFO or a COO or a facilities director, this is going to put you beyond. And even if you have terrific underrepresentation, this is still going to be a really big project. So we try and strategize early and advocate for you, the institutional staff, what additional support are you going to need? What is the business office going to need? What should the development office be thinking about? And try and package that into a project budget that it's not forgotten, it's not lost. There's a big volume to handle, it's added work. And if you want to free up your CFO and COO to focus on that, they might need some support somewhere else in order to do that. So it's, we advocate for it, and, we often get it, but it's, again, it's all part of a budget discussion, but we don't fail to recognize the stress that will put on an institution, and try and recognize it up front and plan for it.
Because there will come a time when the capital project is a full-time job for a number of staff, And yet the organization has to continue to operate and do all these things that it would normally be doing, putting on an exhibition, running the school. And so you want to make sure that you have that support. And a lot of times, this is, it's early in the project. There is a significant cost associated with it. You're either bringing on outside consultants or you're bringing on additional staff. And, you're early in the fundraising, so it's a big decision for institutions to make. But if you don't set it up in the right way, the whole thing can just fall apart because the staff are completely overwhelmed. So it's really important. And likewise, the decision-making is very important because as you get into the project, as Suzanne said, time is everything. And if the organization is not, if the right people haven't been brought in at the right time to participate in the decisions early on, you get some department that says, wait a minute, why are you doing that project over there when, we could be a part of that, or we need space. And you want to make sure that that's all thought through at the beginning. So it's really important to have those kind of initial planning meetings, to have that strategy, to have what are your strategic goals, not just about, we have this opportunity to build a building, but really think through how it can benefit the whole organization, underlies everything that you're going to do.
Yeah, definitely budget for the cost of doing your own project internally. There's a real cost to that, because it's time you can't spend on something else. And so therefore it should be quantified. And then, start thinking about the pre-hires, the pre-operating costs. If there's a new facilities director that might be implicated because now you're going from one building to three, use the project as the leverage to look at a whole organizational matrix of staffing and how that's structured, because your institution is going to operate differently once that level of change occurs. The earlier you can start thinking about that, that's better. And then the people in place are now seeing the construction, knowing where the bodies were buried, and will be better able to pick that up and operate it with some advanced information and education about this new project. So again, you can't always do that, but to the extent you can, it really helps a lot for that first year of operation.
Yeah. Having your operating staff involved, also they can help you identify costs of different choices that you might make, so that over the long term, building a building one way or the other could be more or less expensive. And it's not just at the staff level, it can also be at the board level. Very early in thinking about a project, you might identify a need on your board for more people who are able to help you with development, or more people who are, who have some expertise in real estate or construction that can give you guidance, and you might actually try to develop your board before you go into. So that's sort of part of your strategic planning for future growth of the institution, so that you can create these committees and have the right people available so that you're not overwhelming the board members you have who are already doing the job of running the institution, from an oversight perspective.
Should we talk a little bit about bringing on the external team? Not as kind of a scary slide, that I guess shows how many people, how many organizations will actually touch a given project. Susan, when you come onto a project, are you usually the first one there? Should you be the first one there? Francis, I'll pose the same question to you.
But we are often the first one in, but not always. Sometimes they've already brought on the architect, but now they realize they need to structure the whole project. And so we work together during concept design, early phases of design, to understand the project. From that, we then begin to better understand what all of the resources might actually, what we begin to identify them. Are we doing a complex project that needs a complex approval? Do we need a zoning attorney? Do we need, and sometimes that comes out of some design ideas where the volume is going to be built.
Well, most of these people on the list right now are part of the design team. So I would say there's a design team and a team that makes it happen. So And you're missing 17 or 18 different
There's gonna be about 500 people working on the
I
project.
think these are some of the consultants that we don't think of. Automatically, we think there's going to be an architect and an engineer and a CM, an owner's rep, a lawyer.
There can be many owner direct, and then there can be many under the architect as a prime agreement, sub-consultants there. But there will be many other direct contracts with the owner, and that can be overwhelming. If you've never managed that level of contract administration, that can be new, and it has to be carefully done, and communication protocols are really important.
Yeah, and if you have a regulatory approval process associated with the project, if it's a landmark, if it needs some kind of city approval, if there's a variance needed or other kinds of zoning, you might have to do an environmental review, the community will be involved, you're gonna go before the community board, then you need to think about consultants that you might not have brought on until later in the design process, you may need sooner, because you're gonna need to be able to answer questions about how bright is the building gonna be, what's the traffic gonna be like, is there gonna be noise associated with the construction, how long is the construction gonna last, is there gonna be, what's the logistics plan, because the neighbors are gonna wanna know, are you gonna take away parking, are you gonna take a lane of traffic for your construction staging, are you gonna knock down a tree, and you're gonna need to be able to answer those questions to make your way through the regulatory process, so sometimes that part of planning is really important.
Yeah, in fact, there might be a whole little troop of people that goes and visits every elected official that could possibly have an impact on this project repeatedly before every meeting. So that's another enormous.
Whether you need a communications consultant or someone
Or
of a
lobbyist.
PR plan,
I
a
think they're
lobbyist.
actually called lobbyists now.
Some institutions have an in-house group that's very strong, but, when you're getting into these public hearing situations, it helps to have a little guidance and have a plan for how you want to control the messaging to the extent you can.
This goes back to your point about in-house staff. You might suddenly wake up one morning and have a need to have 600 of your closest friends write a letter to the local assemblyman. Someone has to make that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a number of people, and there's a coordinated way to do that, and of course, we'll get into procurement.
Right, and I will touch on one thing that's actually not in the presentation, but just so that you're all aware, when you have certain kinds of city and state approvals, then your lobbyists, your lawyers, sometimes your architects and other team members, and the institution itself may need to register as a lobbyist with the city and the state, and so don't be surprised to hear about that. The definition of lobbying for these kinds of approvals is incredibly broad, stuff that really you think of as being strictly legal or strictly design oriented, where you're not, the lobbying that you think of is you're going to talk to your elected official and try to convince them to support the project, but even talking to the Department of City Planning about future approval that you're going to request can be considered lobbying under the law. So you may hear that and don't be surprised, because it can be daunting.
So let's spend the final couple of minutes talking about requests for proposals, or RFP, which, I think we were all talking several times before this presentation, and we feel that a good RFP really represents the culmination of the processes of planning your project, organizing yourself internally, and coming to a consensus about what objectives the project should serve. And these are slides that Francis put together. The goals of an RFP are to define institutional objectives, communicate the goals of the project, get the architects and the developers excited about submitting. I love this one because we work with clients on RFPs all the time, and I had to admit to Francis, and I hope she still likes me, that really I never thought about this. I think about things like, is it written clearly? Is it written in a way that it's going to make it easy to respond? Is it written in a way that's going to make it easy to compare responses? But I never really thought about excitement, conveying yourself as a really terrific, excited client, and that you want to do a
So
project
the most
for.
important thing.
And an organized client, right?
But an organized client is good, yeah, so you can use an RFP to get, to in-house, to get everybody to agree why are we doing this project? So you could, everyone gets on board. But the most important line in the RFP is probably the mission statement, where you say, this is going to be our most exciting project for the next 100 years, and this is going to completely reimagine the institution. When I read that, I'm like, yeah, let's submit. On the other hand, if I read something that says, we'd like you to submit and you have 6 days to answer, and by the way, send in 2 years of your financial statements, and let us know if you've ever been in jail or if you've ever been, by the time I get to the end of that, I'm like, oh, why are we doing this? So I think it's really,
Lead
fine.
off with the excitement.
Lead off with the excitement, and then tell us everything
Yeah.
you want to know, but let us know why it's important, because otherwise it's like an Easter egg hunt. You don't know what you're being told. So I would also add to that the smartest and best writer on your team is the one that should write the RFP, and don't just hand it off to someone in the back room who's going to Xerox something from before, because that really is your moment to communicate what's the point of all of this. That's my favorite.
Yeah, and it's really an important one.
Yeah.
And then Francis put down some thoughts about what's a good process for writing an RFP, organizing roundtable discussions, to your point of getting
Yeah.
buy-in from all the internal stakeholders.
Absolutely critical, because how many times have we gotten an RFP where the dean of the school never weighed in, and that's the person that's going to be running the place, or the trustee that's actually writing the check never weighed in, and there's some big piece that person wants to see. So this really is a moment for everybody in the institution to hear from each other and agree on objectives.
Right. And resolving key issues in advance of selection, so there are some really big picture issues about the project. And if these things are not addressed but left open-ended, that's going to be reflected in the quality of the responses.
I guess I would add that, sometimes you don't know but share what you know, and hopefully you've gotten the buy-in that we've been talking about, but quite often it's the programming and concept process that really brings a lot of those things to light, and then you have another alignment session, once you've got more
I think
information.
that ZOR has a great process for that process. I was hearing Susan and Francis chatting about the opportunity of an expanded project expense, but actually, I think ZOR opened that door by making the first phase called concept plan and programming. So we substituted the word master for concept, and before you know it, we were touching everything, which made their whole program intensely meaningful as compared to just renovating a townhouse. But you guys opened that door. We just changed one word.
Well, we ask questions.
Yeah.
Because, again, you're
And you
spending a
generated
lot of money.
excitement.
Are these the right dollars
Mm-hmm.
in the right direction? And should we at least ask questions? The questions are cheapest now.
Yep.
You could still do a renovated townhouse, but.
Oh, we did renovate the town. Most everything else.
Then maybe we'll look at these last slides where we wrote down all of the elements that you can include in an RFP, and as Susan says, you might not have all of the information, you might not have the answers to all of the questions, but the more complete an RFP and the more defined the request, the more consistent and responsive the proposals will be. And, sometimes I think always an RFP process is an opportunity to learn about your project. In the process of interviewing the respondents, you can ask questions. Well, what if we did it this way? Or maybe for certain variables, you can say, we're either going to do A or B. Tell us what you think in your response. What would be preferable?
The classic case is, we're going to build a 100,000 square foot building, and by the way, we have $3 million. Are they lying to us? Do they not know? Is it total ignorance? Should we go and say, wait a minute, is the budget important or are the square feet important? Let's get on the same page and decide what we want to do. It's really a chance for a dialogue.
We've also had great success using a design challenge concept in an RFP process.
Good.
Now, this might be something you would offer a stipend to firms because now they're going to actually do a little work for you. So you want to be very considerate of that. But there might be, all right, here's our picture, give us 3 solutions that might work with, the following like major components that we're trying to solve. And then suddenly, if you have 5 firms, and you probably don't want to go out to more than 5 because it's very unwieldy, think about an RFP to RFP process first.
Yeah.
And get to a manageable number, 3 to 5. And then if you're asking for design challenge submissions, first of all, you want to give them a little more time also. Then you're going to get some really interesting ideas back and have a very engaging interview process, and institutions and trustees really get a lot out of that. They feel like that's been a good process. They've now gotten to know that firm a little bit, kind of test driving somewhat, how they think, how they approach. So there are, if you have a little more time and you want to, use some resources, that can be a very helpful strategy in the RFP process.
It also gets you out of essay writing. Architecture is that good. So instead of asking us what our philosophy is, just ask us to design a few things and tell us how we would think. Much is actually better.
Yeah. I think we're right around 10 o'clock, so I think we'll stop the discussion there, although I'd love to continue talking about this. I don't know if anybody has any final questions, comments, thoughts?
Well, I don't want to have us go over, but there was that slide that I'll be, having nightmares about of all the consultants. And I found personally, looking into a master planning process for my institution, that it suddenly became very hard to understand exactly what that entailed, because it seems to mean a lot of different things to different people, and it also seems to implicate a lot of different consultants. So there are planning architects, master planning firms, consultants who utilization consultants. And it's a little hard for me to figure out where to enter into that process. I assume there are a lot of different ways, but in 30 seconds, anyone wants to comment a little bit, guide to the
It starts in some ways with the goals of the master plan. If what you're trying to do is find more space or make the space better or buy more space, each one of those things leads to a little clump of consultants that would work, that would be the answer. So it really comes from you first.
I can speak directly to, we're working on a new teaching and learning center on campus. We're actually post-excavation. The way that we started that process was we actually did engage. We did an RFQ and then an RFP for master planning based on the project that we were looking at. We chose the architect based on some of the experience that they had also on campus as well as zoning experience. They created a master plan for us that we then pitched to the Board of Trustees in terms of starting the process. From there, we then did another RFQ and RFP to get us to the architect. We had a minimal amount of consultants that were direct to us, only to really get us to the zoning application, understand where we needed to go. And then, as Francis indicated, there were a number of consultants that were part of our prime agreement when we did get to the design architect for the new building. However, there were, and still continue to be, about half a dozen direct consultants that we maintain, because either it's not within the architect's base expertise or because we felt that we wanted to have an independent experience. Communications is actually a great one for us, and we brought that on relatively early in the job because we also knew that we would have that neighbor scenario that you were talking about in the other situation. But we really started with master planning, which was based on the strategic plan that our president had already done.
That might be different skill sets, right? So as Francis was saying, it's the right consultants for the right scope is really what you're looking for.
And just about the master plan that you entered
Yeah.
into, was that for your entire campus or just with regards to
It's a great question, because we needed to start actually with how much FAR was available on campus for us based on the strategic plan. We knew what we wanted to do, but we didn't know how much space we would have. So we started with the FAR analysis, and then from the FAR analysis, we then went into the master planning, and frankly, we had a small, medium, and large scenario based on the strategic plan was loose in terms of how big a space we needed. And after we did the master planning, we then went to the board and said, we really think that we can use the large scenario. Here's what fits into this building based on that, and then received board approval to proceed with fundraising. So,
And then there's phasing, and, there's all sorts of, slice and dice. If, you can go forward on a direction, but then ease into it too, and that's a whole nother conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.